Well, I might have thought I was broken, and coming to the realization that humans aren't broken was one of those things that happened along the journey.
You're listening to the Free the Animal Podcast, brought to you by freetheanimal.com. I'm your host, Richard Nikoley, and this is your jungle of self-direction, where the audacity and hubris to live by your own exclusive authority are celebrated, and those who complain about that are dismissed. We're a little bit practical, a little philosophical, and a little bit rock and roll. So join me weekly for commentary and interviews with interesting people. You can follow me on Twitter, also Facebook, and you can check out the show notes at freetheanimal.com. Now, let's get into the show. And I'm here welcoming Angelo Coppola to my first interview of this podcast series. Angelo blogs at Humans Are Not Broken, and he is also a podcaster himself. And in fact, when I started this, I said, well, my first guest has got to be my favorite podcast. Welcome to the show, Angelo.
Oh, thank you very much, Richard. I'm glad to be with you. And it's the Free the Animal Podcast, right?
It is the Free the Animal Podcast. And yours is latest in Paleo, which for me was way back. And it was This Week in Paleo, I believe.
Oh, yeah. You're going way back. No, about
way
over
back.
5 years ago. Yeah, over 5 years ago, it started off as This Week in Paleo. I did about 20 or so episodes of that when the 5x5 network, Dan Benjamin over there, got in touch with me and asked me if I'd like to publish the show on his network. And what happened was one of his main competitors was Leo Laporte, who is kind of well known for like the This Week In type of thing. He did This Week in Tech, which was probably the biggest podcast at the time and is still a very popular one. So we kind of had to change the name in order to, just make things match up a little bit better with the network. And so from that point forward, it was Latest in Paleo, and been doing that since about 2011. This Week in Paleo started in 2010. Wow. So yeah, and usually when I come onto a show, I have a chance to listen to what that show is like or something like that. But being on your pilot episode is pretty cool, and glad to be here.
I'm glad to have you. So now we know each other because of the whole paleo thing, and going way back. But you have a story before the podcast. Can you give us a brief history of that?
Okay. How far back are you talking?
Well, I mean, when you
little life story here, or
when you got into the paleo thing, how broken were you?
Okay. Well, I might have thought I was broken, and coming to the realization that humans aren't broken was one of those things that happened along the journey. In fact, with the show, and maybe we can get into that a little bit later on. But let's see. I'm a 6-footer. I weigh about 250. I weighed about 250 pounds when I got started, and now I'm down to 160. So, almost a 90-pound weight loss. So what happened in between? I was overweight or obese or struggling with my weight for pretty much all of my life. I grew up in an immigrant Italian family, which pretty much means I absolutely loved food, and it was just a really big deal in my family growing up. My mom was exactly what you picture when you think of the Italian-American matriarch who spends a lot of time in the kitchen, makes everything from scratch. Yeah,
everybody has it in their head now. Right.
Exactly. So, and that's what I grew up with, and it really gave me a strong appreciation for food. But, at the same time, I still had access to all kinds of junk food, snacks, cereals for breakfast, bags of chips, and that kind of thing. And I went on to become an obese kid, which really wasn't all that common when I was growing up. We're talking about like in the 1980s. So I did end up losing some weight a few times over the course of my life, but I always gained it back, in a larger amount than what I lost. So same story that you hear all the time with that. And I think what makes me unique right now is the fact that I have gone from this obese person down to a not only normal weight person, but a relatively lean person. And I kept that weight off now for about 6 years. I first heard about paleo. It wasn't really referred to as paleo at the time, but it was back in the 90s. I read The Paleolithic Prescription. That was Dr. S. Boyd Eaton. I also read Neanderthal, which was Ray Audette. The two books, they lined up in some ways, but there was a lot of disagreement between the two books. I did Atkins. Also, I was, became familiar with his approach back in the 90s, tried that, had some success for a while, never could really stick with it long term. Calorie counting was something I had done a lot, and it always works, and calorie counting is very effective until, for me anyway, when I would get to a calorie level that was so low that I just felt hungry all the time. And so at some point it just stops being something that I can do because of hunger. And I think a lot of that had to do with food choices too. So to answer your question about getting into paleo, around it had to be about 2010. I heard Mark Sisson on a podcast, and he really presented an old story to me, because I was familiar with the whole Paleolithic diet type thing and approach from back in the 90s. But he presented it in such a way that was just so positive and so motivational, that I decided, hey, I'm going to actually give this a try. And I had already lost some weight doing calorie counting, and I was trying to do some running as well, but I had injured myself. So I was at a point where I'd kind of plateaued. I hurt my knee, so I couldn't run anymore, and I was kind of stuck at around 200, maybe around 195, 200 pounds. And I never thought that I would switch to a low-carb approach again. But, the primal approach is fairly low carb, and I was just so motivated by what he had to say in that podcast that I gave it a try, started reading more about it, started getting more into like the 2010 paleo scene, which was growing, and there was a lot of websites, communities, articles being written. You had to hunt for them at the time. They weren't just readily available. So got into that. Started, doing the barefoot thing, and helped my knee to heal, and eventually lost probably about another 10 pounds. So, I hovered in that 185, 190 range, which wasn't all that bad for someone who's a 6-footer. It was kind of straddling the line between a normal BMI and being, overweight, right around that 25 mark. And I felt fantastic. That was really the big thing, because I was eating a much more nutrient-dense diet, really focusing on food quality. And that was something that I wasn't doing so much with the calorie counting, and where I had been coming from just prior to that. So I feel like I was re-nourishing my body and doing a lot of good things. Now, of course, over time, I did start tweaking that myself to see how I could feel even better, how I could maybe perform better, how, there were different debates that came up all along the timeline here from 2010 to now with the paleo scene, including safe starches. That was actually a thing. It might be hard to believe for some people getting into it right now, how much debate there was over whether you could eat a potato.
Yes.
So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's, I guess, how I kind of went into it. And then I've also been very keen to tweak it and modify it to my own life as that journey progressed. I'm a bit surprised, because I thought you had actually become acquainted with our I suppose I should say our modern version of paleo, because it kind of, after Cordain published that book, I think in 2000, it wasn't till 2008 or so that it started to get traction. And so your podcast, you started podcasting pretty soon after you got into this. Is that correct? Yeah, that's right. So podcasting wise, I've always loved radio. I've always listened to talk shows, sports, even radio plays, and I'm talking about even back as a kid, and I think that it has something to do with just really enjoying audibly processing information. So that was just something I've always loved, and I've always thought that I would love to get into radio or be a talk show host kind of thing. And I enjoyed listening to podcasts early on, and so around that time, we were also talking, it was a time when obviously paleo was growing quite a bit, but there was just Rob's show at the time. There was just the one podcast. And so podcasting was also relatively new. And I thought, why not? I mean, I think I would really love to create a show. And my main criteria was to really try to make a show that I would enjoy listening to, and that's probably been my guiding criteria ever since. And I figured, even worst case scenario, I'm going to learn a lot about this whole thing technically. I'm going to learn about some things about just speaking, and presenting information, and I could use that professionally and in my career anyway. So I wouldn't consider it a waste of time. And I had teenagers at the time. My older kids were just about to turn teenagers, or were just teenagers. They're about 20 and 21 now. So yeah, they were teens, and they weren't necessarily listening to dad when it came to diet advice, or even life advice in general at that age. And I figured, I'm gonna put down some of my thoughts in audio recording format that at the very least they will enjoy listening to 20 years from now, when they've got kids of their own and that kind of thing. So I didn't go into it thinking, hey, I'm going to be doing this for a really long time. I would have probably bet money that it would have, been something I did for a few months just to get a feel for it, put it out there, maybe help out some other people who were just getting started. But then it kind of took off, and I really, really enjoyed it, and just received so much positive feedback, obviously, from listeners that makes me motivated to do even more. But I also really enjoy the process, and I love following all this stuff. So presenting it back to the audience in audio format is something I enjoy even more than blogging. Although I do enjoy writing as well. It's the idea of kind of producing it into a show and making it entertaining and enjoyable, and something that people look forward to in that way, that I really, really love.
Well, what was interesting to me is that I had listened to a few podcasts. I don't think I'd ever listened to one before this whole. I got into paleo 2008, or maybe late 2007, something kind of initially.
Sure.
But then I started listening. Of course, there was Jimmy Moore's podcast. And then, you mentioned Rob Wolf. It was funny, I mean, great information, but their production value but I don't know what it's like now. I haven't heard it lately, but back then,
Rob Wolf and Andy D's had a really cool chemistry.
It was hilarious. It was hilarious. It's just like, hey, Rob, hey, that's how it started. Yeah. There was no music. There was probably little to no editing. It was kind of just boom, record.
I think there was probably no editing at all. Yeah, and it was very rustic, to say the least. And that was really part of the charm too.
And then one day, I'm up at our vacation home in Arnold. I still remember it. I'm up there, and I'm scanning around. I'm like, what's this late? That was This Week in Paleo. And I think you were maybe into episode 4 or 5 at the time, I recall. So I got wind of it pretty early on. And I listened to it, and I'm like, holy shit, this production value is great. And then I'm like, I should be on that show. And then I start stewing about it. I'm like, I need to get on. I love that show. I love this show. Right? I think by that time I'd already I'd done an interview with Jimmy. So I thought, well, I've been on more shows, so Angelo should invite me on. I don't know how we got hooked up together, but I've been on yours like 3 times, and then the one attempt that didn't quite work out, but it was I really appreciate it, and it was like it was and that's why I say that's why you're here now, is because it was just so great, phenomenal. When I heard your show, and I'm like, that's how you do a podcast. So it's going to take me some time, but you're the one who set the bar for me in terms of throwing together elements, but I'm starting slow and small.
I really appreciate you saying that. That's really cool. I'm glad to have motivated you to do it. And, I think it probably took it probably took me a good 8 to 10 episodes to really start falling into a formula that I understood and liked and enjoyed and thought, okay, this is something I would really like to listen to. And it also just took that long probably for the show to kind of find its own voice.
Uh-huh.
And it was probably around that time. I don't remember the exact episode number, but it was pretty early on when I covered a story about barefoot running or barefoot walking or just the barefoot movement in general. And there was a foot doctor, a podiatrist, that I had a clip of, which he was talking about taking care of your feet in a way that most people hadn't heard of before. And as he was talking, one of the things he said is the human foot is not broken by default.
Right.
And that really was a light bulb moment for me. And I projected that not only, from the human foot, meaning, you don't necessarily need to add a bunch of padding and add a bunch of equipment to a human foot for it to work. Leonardo da Vinci once said that, like, the human foot is the most amazing piece of engineering ever. Yeah. And you don't need to add all these things to it to make it work. And I kind of projected that out a little further to being, human beings aren't broken. We don't need all of this kind of padding and that sort of the padding could be, excess comfort and material things and all of these supplements in our diet, all kinds of add-ons that through marketing we're kind of told, hey, you're presented with this picture of your life is kind of incomplete. Your life isn't something that you're happy with because you don't have all of these things. But the truth is, and everybody knows, that once you get, this toy or that thing, or you try this kind of a add-on or extra comfort, whatever it is, you eventually get used to it, and then it's on to the next thing. So the idea is that through a lot of the messaging, a lot of mainstream and conventional messaging, we're kind of constantly told over and over that we're broken and we need all these little things to fix us. But in reality, a lot of us can move forward in a really big way by taking things away, by subtracting and getting a little bit more down to, pruning those things out of our lives. And just like when you prune a fruit tree or something, you grow back stronger and more fruitful. And you find out that if you just provide yourself with the proper inputs, then good things happen. I mean, the human body has evolved over millions of years, and we have all of these amazing mechanisms that work without us even thinking about them. Mm-hmm. And so what we have to really do is focus, I think, on those lifestyle elements, those inputs that are really within our control. What can we do to supply all of those things in our lives, and then just let things happen the way that they would manifest themselves from that strong foundation.
That's really a perfect analogy to explain your, I've heard your criticisms of your humans not broken thing. And I say, well, what he means is by default, because your tagline, it kind of used to be that way by default, or at least
right.
Yeah, but really, it's fine to drop that, and you're barefooting and thick padded shoes are and that's hilarious because I see people all the time, and and they're so particularly some older folks, and they're very unstable on their big foam the tennis shoes with the foam padding, foam sole that's like an inch thick, and I'm like. And they're like grabbing onto things. I'm like, it's
right.
You're insulated. You're isolated from the ground. Say, let me ask you something. When you're walking around in your stocking feet or barefoot at home, are you having to grab onto stuff all the time? Right?
Right.
And they stop and think, and they're like, no, really. And so yeah, well, it's something. It's almost like it's almost like that there's an attempt to make everybody feel like you just can't live without these various things, when you perfectly well can. So, it makes everybody kind of soft and malleable for marketing, I suppose you could say. So, hey,
I mean, that's exactly what it is.
let's now I want to talk about as you know, we've gone back and forth over the years, not just you and I, but other people, other folks, about the rice. I can remember either from one of your podcasts or maybe even in one of the first time I was on your show, it was the diet is not a diet. And I can't remember the particulars, but even back then we're questioning certain things. And I remember you mentioned, sushi, and that was like, having sushi. And back then that was like kind of like, well, okay, it's like, having chocolate cake or something,
Sure.
Right. And we since come to realize that, white rice is pretty innocuous. It's got some nutrients and it's starch, But the evolution has continued. I've even embraced some whole grains, and of course potatoes, things like that. And then there's the whole gut biome thing, which of course plant paleo touches on that. So explain to me, what is plant paleo?
Okay. Before I do that, I want to say one more quick thing about the humans are not broken thing we were just talking about. And I just want to add real quickly that, that for some people, padded shoes might be the way to go. And for some people, certain supplements might be required. The idea behind humans are not broken, the completed thought is that what you want to do is do that pruning that I was talking about. And so that you get to start from that foundation of a bare minimum and then kind of see what you need. So yeah, for the elderly person who might start off by going with a more minimalist footwear, if they find that it doesn't work with their feet, they might even get like a hairline fracture in their foot somewhere, then hey, add some padding, do what you have to do. Or maybe you are someone who needs arch support. But the idea is not to just jump on all of these things as soon as they're presented to you as this solution to all your problems, because one of the main solutions might be to take away what you're already using. And that is a message that never gets out there, right? Because there is absolutely no money to be made by saying take your shoes off.
Exactly.
There's money to be made by selling you a different, better, thicker, more arch supported shoe. There's no money to be made in saying don't take these 28 pills that you're taking, and no one should stop taking 28 pills without talking to their doctor. But that's the point, is that the message of pruning back is not a profitable one. And in our society, the most loud voices are the ones who are sort of spending money to be heard. And, that may or may not be a good thing, but that's sort of just the reality, the pragmatic reality of it. And what gets lost are these solutions that are free, right? These solutions that don't necessarily put money in someone else's pocket. So that's also part of the humans are not broken thing. It's not to say that if you do require something, you should feel bad about it, or right. You're doing it wrong if you're doing it if you're doing something different than for me, or if you're not doing living a minimalist lifestyle, because that should really mean different things to different people. So anyway, I just want to put that out there. But that's an important point.
It was perfect because it reminded me immediately of way back. I got into the intermittent fasting, and I read Brad Pilon's book, Eat, Stop, Eat, and I still remember one of the thing that just jumped out at me is he says when talking of weight loss, everyone is always saying, what do I need to eat to lose weight, right?
Right.
And well, how about nothing?
Sure.
For at least a period of time. So, and that kind of goes right into, instead of like, what do I need to get to do this? What can I take away? Or the same, or something I like to say to people, when confronted with some problem or issue that you perceive, always remember that one of your options is to do nothing. Right.
Exactly. That's very true.
Yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes it's really about stepping back in order to move forward. If you're out there planting a garden, you're dropping seeds in the soil, and you step back and you plant the next row and you step back, and then eventually that leads to a harvest. Or sometimes we just need to step back to see the bigger picture, and then that will let us move forward in the right direction, not just in some random direction. And then sometimes we even need to step back kind of in time and go to a time when we had less. And the paleo diet paradigm is actually a lot about that. It's saying, let's step back to a time when the food was more nourishing, it was more in a whole food state, and let that bring us health and move us forward in that way. So yeah, I mean, standing still is an option, stepping back is an option, and moving forward with various interventions is definitely an option. But it's just that we have to be a little bit careful about what we hear in the media, in advertising, and even professionally, because a lot of what we hear, the dietary guidelines in the United States, for example, there are groups suing the USDA over it. There are, the sugar lobby's upset about it. Every group is upset about something, and essentially, we have to be really careful with the decisions we make. And to me, the humans are not broken. Phrase or just that idea, that mentality is a reminder. It's just a reminder to remember these kinds of things, that, hey, maybe the right solution here is to go back to a more minimalist state, see what I need at that point, and then start adding on slowly and experimenting with things that way. And it's funny that you say that sometimes the right solution is, how about not eating? I'm actually recording with you today in the middle of an experimental 4-day fast. So I'm on 48 hours now, over 48 hours without food. And it's been a very interesting experiment.
You're going to die.
I know, right? It's great. There have been some very interesting, there has been a lot of interesting research about fasting recently. Mm-hmm. The 5-2 diet is all the craze in Europe, or especially in the UK, where they cut back to like 600 to 800 calories a day for 2 days a week. Dr. Walter Longo has done some amazing research on cancer and fasting, and also on just resetting or completely rebuilding your immune system. It's amazing that, there's this sort of system of autophagy that is evolutionarily built into us, to where, there were times when we didn't eat. We just went without food for periods of time, for whatever reasons, whether it was, a lot of work that needed to be done, or just, not having the availability, storms, who knows, all these kinds of things. But humans are extremely well adapted at going long periods of time without food. Right. And so those systems exist for a reason. And it just seems like evolution took advantage of those periods of very low or no food consumption to do some rebuilding and repair work in the body. And so that to me has been very, very interesting. And it's where I've been spending a lot of my spare time looking at research and whatnot. I'm very interested in Longo's research. Mattson has done some research on this that's also pretty interesting. And I'll be talking a little bit more about these kind of things on Latest in Paleo as well. But prior to all this, you had asked about plant paleo, and I sort of took this in a different direction. What was the question there?
No,
again?
How about you step back and give us the big picture on what plant paleo is?
Okay, well, the background would be, a good way to set it up would be, look, there was no one paleo diet, and most people in the paleo community fully acknowledge that. I mean, I'm not saying anything new to anyone who's already in the paleo community. You can't go back, 100,000 years and say all humans ate this way, or 50,000 years or what have you, because we started spreading all over Africa, and then eventually all over all the continents, and different climates. There was just different pressures, different altitudes, different availability, and so the diets varied by quite a bit.
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
latitudes as well.
Oh yeah, I
The
mean,
diet of Inuit is vastly different than the diet in Polynesia. Right.
exactly, and it does seem that the diet of the Inuits have a very big influence on the current paleo approach, and it's probably pretty important to remember that they're an outlier community.
Yes.
They were living on the extreme edges of where humans were able to survive, and they did it exceptionally well. But you can't really separate the diet from the lifestyle. They lived an Arctic lifestyle, and part of that Arctic lifestyle was that diet. Now, very few of us do that. We live in a much more climate controlled and a comfortable environment most of the time. Now, when you do look at all of the different, even just hunter-gatherer populations in more modern times, you see hunter-gatherer groups who are eating 90% animal-based foods and 10% plant, and that would be maybe the Inuits during certain times of the year. And but you also see hunter-gatherer groups who are eating diets that are 90% plant-based
Mm-hmm.
and 10% animal-based, and they're doing very well too. So you're seeing really good health results from this broad spectrum of plant to animal ratios in diets. The Kitavans are a great example of a group that are robustly healthy and who eat a diet that is about 70% carbohydrate. It's about maybe 70% carb, 15% protein, 15% fat. So they're doing extremely well. The Tarahumara, whose staple food is sort of a cornmeal, and maybe not so much currently. I'm talking about the Tarahumara of Mexico, and their diets have changed a lot recently. But if you go back like 50, 60, 70 years, 80% carb, and they were doing extremely well. And to them, like a short run was 100 miles.
Well, and something when and it's I think difficult, but I think it's important for the people who are listening in who aren't familiar with all the catchphrases, because when we're talking about macronutrients, we're talking about proteins and lipids or fats and carbohydrates, and so when you say carb, of course, short for carbohydrate. But in plant paleo, what is a carbohydrate principally in plant paleo?
Okay, so in plant paleo, the number one commonality that you find from all Paleolithic diets and all even more recent hunter-gatherer diets is that they're whole food based. And so a carbohydrate, the Kitavans and the Tarahumara were not eating highly refined and processed carbs. They're eating whole food carbs. And so plant paleo is exceptionally whole food based. And a lot of people might say, well, I mean, so is paleo, right? Well, most implementations of paleo do rely on quite a bit of oil, for example, as a source of calories. A tablespoon of oil has 120 calories. 2 tablespoons, what does that make it? 240.
Yes.
So if you're eating a 2,400 calorie diet and you're eating 2 tablespoons of oil every day, you're eating a 10% highly processed, highly refined diet. 10% of your diet is coming from a food that is highly refined. I mean, it's taking everything out of the food except for the fat.
It is. It's the empty. I just did a blog post on this, saying if first of all, if you don't make distinctions about carbohydrate and you don't make a distinction between a teaspoon of table sugar and a piece of fruit or a potato or a squash, then how come how come you're talking about fats?
Sure, well,
highly
it's just
refined
absolutely
fat.
necessary.
Because if you run the nutrition on just refined fat, I mean, butter has some nutrients in it, but if you take any oil, like even coconut oil or olive oil, it's got very almost nothing in the way of vitamins and minerals in it, and so it is kind of the empty calorie of the fat community, just like sugar is the empty calorie of the carbohydrate community, so that and if you look at red meat is almost depending on which cuts. But on average, it's about 50% of calories is fat. And so my question is, that's not enough. You've got to like heap on all sorts of added fats to it.
I think if evolution has showed us anything, that it is that we can get plenty of nourishment and plenty of the nutrients, plenty of all the macronutrients from whole foods. There's no reason. I mean, we're the only animal on Earth who would refine and isolate a certain macronutrient and add that additional stuff to our diet. So no, I mean, absolutely, what we need is already found in the whole foods, and that's one of the guiding principles of plant paleo. And people don't seem to have as big of a problem differentiating between fats. For example, most people would say olive oil is a healthy fat, or that like omega-3 fats are healthy, but to stay away from trans fats. I mean, that's universally accepted. In carbs, like you said, refined sugar versus something like a potato, or, well, maybe that's a bad example because some people are still anti-tuber, but a sugar versus like the carbs you would get in a vegetable. Right. People are saying, okay, well, that's different. And even with proteins, people understand that, gluten, for example, is a protein. So they have no problem saying certain proteins are bad. But when it comes to just this idea of processing, of this being a processed food, I think a lot of people still consider certain oils to be nutrient dense, and they still consider it to be not a processed food. And I think that, hey, maybe there's still room for some of this stuff in your diet. Maybe you want to lightly grease a pan in order to cook a little bit easier or whatever. But really think about the quantities that are going into the diet. Because like I said, 2 tablespoons, that's 240 calories. That could be 10% of your diet. And so, like anything else, the poison's in the dose.
Yes.
And then, so also referring back to archaeology when it comes to the plant paleo approach, there's evidence that goes back 100,000 years showing that humans were possibly eating grains. I mean, if you look at any of these individual archaeological finds, it might be difficult to say without a doubt, hey, they were definitely eating grains or legumes. Because, what they'll do is they'll find like a little bit of mashed grains up on a grinding stone or something in a mortar and pestle, and kind of make an assumption that, hey, they were grinding this for food. Could have been grinding it for alcohol, who knows what else, or medicine. But there have been so many finds recently. And then if you look at like the Ohalo 2 finding in Israel, I mean, there's practically a bakery there. I mean, they found a 20,000-year-old oven where they're grinding barley and wheat. And it very much has the makings of a Paleolithic bakery. So I do think that human beings have been eating some grains, definitely some legumes in their diet for a really long time, especially, and again, it's regional. I mean, Middle East for sure. Southern Europe, a lot of these findings are in Italy, France, and Germany. So there's findings there as well. So people whose ancestors come from those regions may be better equipped to consume these kinds of foods. And, there's even stronger evidence of like cooked barley being found in dental remains. So there are these findings, and it's important to remember that plants don't hold up quite as well as bones.
Right, in terms of
sure. Sure, and even when we're measuring things like when we find fecal matter that's been preserved, our systems for measuring kind of can have a hard time differentiating between plant and animal proteins. Not only that, we're also not sure where human beings were doing most of their eating. Sure, there might be a lot of we may find animal remains at the hearth, or at a place that looks like it might have been where they were based, but maybe they were doing half of their eating throughout the day while they were hunting and gathering, and that can be just scattered all about, and it might have been mostly plant food, which is highly likely because it's so readily available, and
we see what they eat now. I mean, look
absolutely
look at the Hadza diet. Honey makes up 18% of their average calories throughout the year, right?
Yeah.
And then there's a lot of tuber type stuff. Now, they eat a fair amount of meat too. I think it comes in around maybe 20-30% of their diet being animal based. But that's certainly a lot
But
different.
there again, even when you look at those animals, what are they? It's porcupines, and it's
Right.
very lean, wild animals, which
Right.
is a lot different than saying we can just eat tenderloin all
Yeah,
day.
exactly. And and the other thing, one thing with you talking about grains, is that we also have to understand is that when these people ate grains, they were eating the whole grain. They were eating
Absolutely.
they were eating the bran, the germ, and the endosperm. Whereas 90% of what people eat now is just the endosperm. White refined flour, and even if it's so-called whole grain, it's just some bran added into that. You have to really go out of your way to get freshly ground with the germ itself, because the germ has oil, and it's where a lot of the nutrition is. I like to think of it as like the equivalent of the egg yolk in egg white. So when you're eating the refined grains that we have today, it's analogous to going out and eating egg white omelets, where basically you have half the protein and all the sodium in the egg, and all the other nutrients are in the yolk that you've just tossed away, right? So
No, that's a good point. And so
and the other thing is that some of the problems that people associate with the grain consumption, the refined grain consumption, intuitively at least, when you eat the whole food that includes the bran and the germ, oftentimes there is the yin yang aspect of the food. So this is not great for us in too much quantity, and this is not bad for us, but too much is wrong. But together they have a certain synergy, and it's the synergy is not for our benefit. The synergy, of course, is for the plant's benefit itself. But we find that throughout nature, where there's kind of this where the plant's own protective mechanisms that protect it from various environmental things are what
from
make it
insects, from drought,
yes, are what or weather, drought, all that sort of stuff are exactly, and we evolved side by side. So we evolved to eat the whole thing and not just pick out certain parts of it, right? So, and that's, but there's a lot, and the paleo folks understand this very well in terms of the animals. Who hasn't heard of nose to tail eating, right? So
Sure. Yeah, and it's interesting because I wonder really how much of that took place way back in the Paleolithic. I wonder how much nose to tail eating there even was back then. I have a feeling that, they probably had favorite cuts, and it was probably centered around a lot of organ meat, maybe certain cuts of muscle meat, marrow, and some of those kinds of things. But there was no real waste back then. So even if you took an animal and you didn't necessarily consume it all, there were scavengers waiting in line, and insects, and there was an entire process that would break down the whole animal versus something like we have today with CAFOs and slaughterhouses and landfills. It wasn't that process.
So how much meat and seafood is in your general version of plant paleo? Understanding, people could have all sorts of different ratios and focus on different kinds of plants.
Sure. So I actually include it is an omnivorous approach, so I'm glad you asked that. And I include about 6 ounces of meat per week, and that could be a mix of like organ meat, fish. I don't eat too much red meat at all anymore. Some poultry once in a while. I do a lot of bone broths. So, it's not exactly a meat, but it's still an animal-based food. I'll make like a chicken stock or something, and then I can cook anything from, speaking of grains, you can just boil your barley or your steel cut oats or something like that in a chicken broth instead of water. So and I'll also eat probably 2 to 3 eggs a week. And part of the reason for that is just to make room for all of these plant foods that really seem to be health promoting and disease fighting because of all of these compounds that are in these. I mean, there's just probably millions of compounds that are in there. We track a few of them. We probably know about 30, 40,000 of them that are cataloged, but there are so many compounds in plants that we don't even, we haven't even begun to touch yet. But these foods all seem to be very medicinal, very, very health promoting in humans. And also it increases the fiber intake. And one of my big goals was to really create an environment in my gut that promoted a healthy biome. And I don't think that you have to go, 100. I don't think the way to do that is to like add psyllium to your the normal diet that you're eating. It's really about getting all of these nutrients and all of the fibers that the gut bacteria eat in your whole foods. And when you do that, well, these really nutrient-dense plant foods and high-fiber plant foods also happen to be pretty low in calories. So you end up having to eat quite a bit of those, and that displaces a lot of the meat in the diet. So I didn't really cut back on the meat because I thought, well, that stuff's not good for me.
I get it.
I didn't say, hey, I don't want to eat, an elk steak because I think it's going to make me give me cancer at some point. My real motivation behind it was I want to get all of these plant foods in my diet, and that makes it really hard to eat like a fatty cut of meat that's going to have 700-800 calories in it and is going to be a significant portion of my daily caloric intake and crowd out all of these other foods that I want to make sure that I am eating. So that's where it started. I wanted to include the most nutrient dense diet that I could, and also eating large amounts of food is something that works really well for me. So, which is ironic to talk about in the midst of a 4-day fast. But what happens too when you get these nutrient dense foods that are low in calories, they are bulky. There's a lot of food involved, so you can eat really large, bowls of something like maybe with beans and greens and some grains mixed in. You can have a really large salad. These things take up room in your actual stomach, and there's sensors in our stomach that help us to determine when we're full. So by filling up by literally filling up, that sends signals to the brain that we are done eating, and it also helps us to prevent overeating. And for me, that's always been a really big thing with being attracted to sweets and snack kind of foods in the evenings and that kind of thing. I find that if I just make sure that I'm eating really healthy and hearty meals, big sized meals, that I can kind of stay away from that.
Yeah. It's very, and I've people who read my blog know that I've really upped my intake. In terms of the plants, and it's exactly the same thing. It's like I'm eating way less animal products, not for any other reason than I'm kind of interested. I kind of am doing. I'm doing a lot of soups lately. Like potato soup and that'll have like 3 slices of bacon in a whole big pot. Cup of milk. And a quart of chicken stock. Same thing with the beans. Made a pot of beans this weekend, and I used 1 pound of smoked pork necks. But once you boil them to where the meat falls off, it renders like 6 ounces of meat that's in your big, huge pot of white beans and potato soup. Right. So, and to me, it makes the animal product more of a flavor enhancer. Plus, you pick up a few good nutrients, and so I've just done it from that because I love these dishes so much, and I'm doing things I haven't even done before, like making oat groats and
yeah.
Right. I just had a big bowl this morning. I loved it, man. It's so chewy and nutty.
Right.
Uh,
I'm a big fan of steel cut oats or oat groats as well.
yeah,
And you can do things with those kinds of whole grains that you would have done with like bread or pasta in the past. So you can, instead of throwing in like pasta into a soup, try actually cooking your groats in the broth
right.
and making this kind of a using that in place of the pasta, and it is absolutely delicious. I made some steel cut oats with chicken soup that we had made. So it was like a vegetable chicken soup and with oats in it. And it was just so, it was wonderful to eat. The flavor on it was just wonderful. And then that texture in your mouth that you're talking about, really,
just
really
like
cool.
there's lots of soups that
Very
have
versatile.
there's lots of soups that also have rice in them, so you can just use the oat groats instead of rice. In fact, when the oat groats are cooked, it looks like brown rice actually.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, a lot of soups already call for things like barley, so this isn't much of a stretch either.
Right.
I mean, this is probably the way people cooked for a very, very long time before all of the processing and different kinds of dishes that we're used to today came into play. Now, I also I also realized that on a day-to-day basis, my diet is pretty simple, pretty plain. I still make it pretty flavorful with various seasonings and whatnot, but it's a simple food diet. Mm-hmm. But when you look back at our history, evolutionarily, hunter-gatherer wise, we also like to party, and so I'm updating Plant Paleo right now on the website. I call it version 0.8, and I think all diets should have a version number on them. But anyway, I mean, I started it this way to say, hey, this is a work in progress, and I don't have this on the website yet, but I've added in one day a month that we're calling a food festival, and basically we will eat whatever we want and have people over and have a party. And it's not necessarily like the dancing at the fire and all. Maybe it could turn into that one day, but for us, it's really been about
that's smoked baby back ribs day, right, or something like
anything.
Anything. Chicken wings.
For one of them, I made homemade eclairs. I mean, so we even went all out dessert one time. We've done one with just deluxe hamburgers, because it's not something we eat on a day-to-day basis, and that just sounded so good. And I made my own deep fried fries on that day as well. Uh-huh. So now those foods all sound like, whoa, deep fried fries, eclairs, what the hell? That's ridiculous. Yeah. But you have to be able to. This is another one of those things where you can step back, right? Because on people tend to be so concerned that every bite of food that enters their mouth has to be absolutely perfect, when you've got to step back and look at your daily consumption. But then you can get really obsessed with the daily consumption and be like, well, did my macronutrients all fall into place? Did I get every single nutrient I needed and this and that and the other? Well, step back and take a look at your diet from a weekly perspective. Right. What if you have one day a week where I tend to eat most of the meat that I was talking about on Sunday. So it'll be like one day a week where I will have a fish day or a meat day or whatever. That doesn't throw off my macronutrients in one way or another in any significant way. And if one day a month you were to pretty much unleash and have whatever it is that you want to eat, even if you were to eat maybe 3,500 calories that one day, and it was not the healthiest food choices, it doesn't affect your overall nutrient intake. It's not going to affect your macronutrients in a significant way, probably even a fraction of a percentage. So we have to look at these things realistically and have a really good relationship with food. And I think one thing that happened, at least earlier on in the paleo community, is that there really was this kind of a obsession with every single bite of food being perfect, and people would shudder at the thought, like we said, of eating something like a potato, or maybe even just the smallest amount of sugar here or there. Right. And so I think it's really important to keep it grounded and stay realistic and recognize that food is also a part of our lives as human beings that is celebratory. And so you don't want to remove those kind of things from your life completely. And then part of the reason why I'm doing the fasting thing right now like I said, not only is the research extremely interesting and promising, in fact, it's probably the most interesting thing that I've been looking at since really following the gut bacteria research. But the other part of the celebrating is that there were feasts, sure, and there were famines. So, and that whole yin yang thing. So if I'm going to have a day a month of a food festival where I'll eat whatever I want, then maybe and celebrate life, maybe it also makes sense to have one day a month where I don't eat at all, and it's more of an introspective day and look inward that way. And it's a different kind of a celebration of life. It's not as outward or loud or it's not as rich. It's much more of an inward kind of a thing. So as I update the plant paleo approach on the website and in my own life first, and then on the website, I'm going to be including a day of food celebration where the rules are basically, as long as you're not allergic to something or it's going to put you in the hospital, have at it. But also balancing that out with a day of fasting. And there's different approaches to fasting as well, and I'll go into more detail. I've never asked anyone, by the way, to try the paleo diet. I've never put it out there as in, hey, you guys are all missing out because this is the way that you're supposed to eat, and everyone out there should be eating plant paleo. Instead, I'm just putting it out there to share something that A, I am enjoying tremendously, and B, that has brought me tremendous health. When I switched from a more paleo approach to a plant paleo approach, I lost that final 20 pounds.
That was my next thing to ask you. So let's just go right into it, because I was going to ask you, what have your results been, and is this your deal for life? And I think you just did your own introduction into those questions.
All right. Well, we'll segue right into that. Right. The immediate result was over a period of a few months, I started losing weight, even though that was not one of the intended outcomes. The experiment or what I was trying to do was just increase the level of plant foods that I was eating in my diet, and also eliminating the processed food. So I got rid of oil. And within a few months, I had lost that 20 pounds. I had gone 20, maybe more, 25 almost, maybe 25 to 30 pounds it could have been. Because I hovered around 185, 190, and then was down to 160 after a few months on plant paleo, and felt absolutely terrific. I'm a walker and a hiker. That's like my main physical activity. I felt like I could walk 100 miles, without stopping. My endurance levels increased. I have some pictures on the website from my 42nd birthday, and most of the comments are about, hey, you've got abs. That was never really the intention. And for someone who struggled for an entire lifetime with obesity and overweight, the ab thing is kind of weird. It was very unexpected. And, so body composition wise, there were great improvements, but also just everything from skin complexion to the endurance, energy, libido. A lot of people said, well, you're later in your life, so you can go ahead and increase your plant consumption, and that's fine because you're not really in your child producing years. You need to eat all this meat to have a healthy libido and have kids. Well, I have 4 children, had 4 children before, and now we're expecting our 5th on the way this summer. And I noticed, if anything, just a further increase in that department as well. Everything that I was measuring in the mirror and as far as subjectively as how I felt improved. And that wasn't really, I shouldn't frame that as if it went from like a strict paleo approach all of a sudden to a plant paleo approach, and all of a sudden I felt these things like a switch, these things all got turned off. It was more gradual because like we were saying earlier, there was this journey we all took from like a low carb paleo approach to, okay, well, then our starch is really safe, and then maybe we went through like that Gemini perfect health diet kind of thing in the middle there, where we were adding some starches, and I did that. I experimented with adding real food starches, and Gemini promotes more like white rice. Today, I would suggest brown rice is better. But as I did add some of these starches and real food carbohydrates to my diet, I felt more energy. I did feel better, and I noticed my pants getting a little bit looser. So like there were things that along the way I kept getting hints that as I was increasing, I hate to say the carbohydrate intake, because really it's as I was increasing more plant food intake, more whole food plant foods in my diet, that I was feeling better gut-wise, and I was feeling better all around and more energetic and that kind of thing. And it eventually evolved into plant paleo.
And we do need to remind people that plants typically include not just carbohydrate, but also some protein and also some fat.
Exactly. So that's why it's
in the way that I've been doing it, with just a little bit of added stuff here and there. Little bit of meats and the soups and things like that. It's typically coming out to be around 70% carbohydrate and 60 to 70%, and then fat 20-ish, and the rest protein.
Right. Yeah, I would say I've done some measurements here and there, and I think I hover around 70 to 80% carb and 10 to 15% protein and 10 to 15% fat. Yeah. So I keep it a little bit lower on those ends, just because I don't add very much fat at all to the diet, and I'm eating a little bit lower amounts of the meat than you are. I'm not sure, like 6 ounces a week is where I'm at right now, 4 to 6 ounces. So anyway, I mean, and that ratio really seems to work out well. Denise Minger did an awesome recap sort of some of the carbohydrate health studies from the past, where she did this epic.
Was that her defensive low fat post?
I don't remember the exact title, but I had her on the show and we had a great discussion about it. But
okay, I'll link that up. So
yeah. What she found was just that there were tremendous results people were seeing from going 10% fat. And I know that, like I said, although I've never asked anyone to try plant paleo, never really promoted it in that way at all. There are a lot of people who have tried it and have talked to me about it, sent me pictures and talked to me about their results. And you're seeing insulin levels go down, and people can't believe it, blood sugar levels going down, because nobody thinks that you can eat 70, 80% carbohydrate and do that. But it's actually one of the most consistent ways you can do that. You can definitely lower glucose levels by not eating any glucose, but it also turns out that you can reverse and return some of the functionality of like the liver and the pancreas if you are losing some weight, and then you can have that normal function so that you can deal with glucose in your diet. So
just like your post a couple weeks ago about the diabetes cure. And the thing is on my blog, I've been doing, we've been talking a lot about the potato hack or the potato diet, where you eat almost nothing but potatoes for a period of time. I had someone in there just the other day, a type 2 diabetic, who decided to give it a try based on the 800 calories, but using potatoes, right? And on insulin, on metformin. And when he first went off the insulin and metformin, his fasting blood glucose was about 250. He's now down to 140 fasting blood glucose in just a matter of a few weeks. Pretty amazing. Fantastic. Yeah. Yes.
The most common things I'm hearing are things about blood glucose levels coming into control, energy levels skyrocketing. A lot of people have mentioned that problems they had with constipation and hemorrhoids have disappeared, and people who suffered a lot from those. Also, skin complexion's a big one. Libido, I keep hearing, and weight loss is just a pretty much across the board kind of thing for most people. And part of it has to do just with when you switch to something new, you don't necessarily know how to cheat the system yet. So if you may not have like this full toolbox of recipes and stuff. Like early days paleo, people were just pretty much meat and vegetable. And then today paleo, there's like books on how to bake cakes.
Oh my goodness.
Paleo. You know what I mean? So
I have one of those papers that auto-generated. I had to go to in fact, I just did it yesterday because I kept going through there. And, from all, it's based on what all your social things are and what they're liking and so on. So I'm looking at it and I'm like, half of the thing is about paleo cookies and brownies and cakes and all articles
Right.
that it's
Right.
So I had to take control of it and start and make sure that stuff gets deleted before it goes out in the morning.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely, if nothing else, I mean, that's what people do want at a certain level. And I think, with the plant paleo approach, as long as you stick with whole foods, it's going to be really, really hard to go, especially mostly plants, whole foods. It's going to be really hard to gain weight. Now, it's more than doable to maintain weight or lose weight. But if we stick with that whole food approach, I do think there's also some room to create some, like take some favorite recipes and maybe massage them a little bit so that they're not necessarily what you were used to eating before, but they're similar. But if we stick with the whole foods and don't go with something that's too flour based or that has all the different additives and whatnot to it, that it can probably still be okay. Like you might not be able to throw together a pizza on white crust or whatever, but you might be able to do something where it's like a barley bowl or a you could use whole wheat berries or something and use similar seasonings, use a little bit of Parmesan cheese so that's not, like a pound of mozzarella in there. Yes. You could use a really nice tomato-based sauce that I've been able to recreate something very similar to what I grew up eating without using any oil. On occasion, sometimes I'll throw in like a teaspoon of oil, and I'm talking about like a giant pot of sauce that I'm making. You can really still make these very good foods, and even on the sweet side, and keep them whole food. And I think part of the reason why people have some trouble with that on the paleo side of things is that they just incorporated things like, replaced whole wheat flour or wheat flour with almond or coconut flour.
Yes, right.
And once you process them like that, they become extremely easy to overeat. Your satiety signals just go away on that. I mean, you're not used to, I don't think we evolved to have these kind of signals that could detect that I just swallowed 2 tablespoons of oil, so I need to be full.
Calories,
Yeah, boom.
Now so you're not actively out proselytizing, as you already said, but it seems to me that these ideas would be far easier to sell to the curious or the needy than this idea of eat all the meat and fat you want, or maybe not. But I think the results are going to speak for themselves. They certainly are for me, and they are for a lot of my readers. And ultimately, you can cherry pick all the research you want to either confirm or deny what you think about things. Mm-hmm. But I'm a blogger with over 100,000 comments on the blog and all the articles that have gone up over the years, and that's kind of my scientific. It's not strictly scientific, but you kind of get an idea of what's going on after a while. When you go years and years, and people are still cropping up with the same problems. They can't lose this last 10, 15, 20, 25 pounds. Their blood glucose is lousy because they have physiological insulin resistance. Not their autoimmune issues aren't any better, and so on. And then you see the exact opposite. And with an omnivorous approach, so it's not some extreme like ketogenic on one extreme versus raw vegan on the other. I don't know why people have to go to extremes. Some people might say that your plant paleo, as you formulate it, is a bit extreme. Only 6, but what's the difference between if you eat 6 ounces of meat a week and say a pound a week? It's not. That's going to all wash out in the laundry. I mean.
Sure. Yeah, and I would encourage people to adjust levels to whatever they think is best for them.
Right.
Right. Because, like I said, you have these hunter-gatherer populations who are showing us that you can live a healthy life and have all kinds of different compositions to your diet. When it comes to the long-term stuff, and we started talking a little bit about like gut health and cardiovascular health, and there's a question as to whether or not processed meats especially could lead to maybe some colon cancer. there's still some, there's debate about whether or not a high fat diet, what does that do to long-term cardiovascular results? I don't know. I mean, to me, it's not nearly as bad as it was made out to be. Fat is definitely not something to be phobic or fearful of, but at the same time, the idea of eating a diet that's composed of whole foods and getting those macronutrients from foods as they appear in nature, and sort of letting things sort themselves out that way makes a lot more sense to me than just attempting to try to like eat something that's 80% fat. A ketogenic diet you don't see anywhere in nature, no animal, no human population, and it's probably impossible to do with nothing but whole foods. You have to pretty much add fat to it.
Right, exactly. You would have to, or else you'd have to be I don't know what you'd have to do. You'd have to. Well, you're basically a bear at that point. You're catching a bunch of salmon and just peeling off and eating the skin and discarding the protein. The leaner meat. That's what bears
I hear what
do.
you're saying, and interestingly enough, even bears in hibernation stay in chronic ketosis. So, I mean, I would say, hey, for some people, it might actually be an approach that works. There's always outliers, but I think that maybe it doesn't. What I end up having a problem with the most, from whether it's low carb or a ketogenic or vegan, all these different approaches, is where they say, this is the only way to live a healthy lifestyle, and to kind of make followers of those approaches really afraid of food, right? And become phobic.
Orthorexia, yes.
Yeah, I mean, that orthorexia, I think, really is a thing. I mean, wanting to eat healthy is great, and it's one thing, but once it becomes like a stressful, anxiety-inducing kind of a pattern, and you have this kind of overwhelming fear about food, then I think that's problematic. And the fact is that anytime you assemble a bunch of studies that are going to prove, quote unquote, prove that like a vegan approach is the way to live the healthiest, or that a low carb approach has the best results, even within those studies, when you dive down into the data, there are people in the study who don't respond as well to the intervention or to the modality. There's going to be maybe you're comparing low fat versus low carb for weight loss, and there might be 50 people in both groups. Well, let's say at the end, the average is that the low carb group lost an extra 1 or 2 kilograms. And so the headlines are all low carb beats low fat, yes. da, 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 da. There might have been 1 or 2 outliers in the low carb group who gained weight.
Yes.
There might have been people who didn't lose any weight at all and just maintained. And then there might have been a few people who responded really well and lost just a huge amount of weight that brought the average down. And then the same thing in the low fat group. You have people who respond at all different levels. So we can't present any kind of, I think, lifestyle factors or lifestyle habits as being, this is the only way. Exactly. Because we're all so much different.
It's something that I really like, whichever range you find in it, because it's omnivorous and there's no fear of fat when it's in whole food form. There's no fear of carbohydrate when it's in whole food form. There's no fear of protein when it's in whole food form. And, and I think we're going to close it up here with this, but I want to say that what's remarkable is as we've gone through this, Angelo, what keeps popping into my head all the time is something that, Michael Pollan has said for years, eat real food, mostly plants, not too much.
I think he nailed it. I might change the word real to whole.
Whole, yes.
Because there's some question there. And even at that, there's maybe some exceptions. But boy, it's really hard to offer much better advice than that simple. In such a concise way.
Yeah. So, hey, Angelo, I want to thank you very much for being on. And we're going to have to do this again sometime. And thank you for the tips on podcasting. I sure am going to use some of that. And I think I'm going to enjoy doing this. So I'll tell everybody again where to find you.
Okay, well, the blog is humansarnotbroken.com, all one word there. and no dashes or anything, humansarenotbroken.com. And you can find Latest in Paleo, my podcast, on iTunes or whatever your favorite streaming software is. And I'm also on Facebook, Twitter, all those kinds of things. But you can find my contact info on the blog.
Very good, very good. And we will talk to you again soon. Angelo, thank you once again for being on.
All right. Thank you, Richard, and good luck with the show.
Thank you. And that will wrap it up for today's episode. Thanks for listening, and join me again next week for another toolkit for surviving the coming zombie apocalypse.